Now, don't get me wrong, I love myself a Brandon Sanderson book, I love me some Middle-earth with Lord of the Rings, and most recently I've really been enjoying the Sun Eater books. However, some of my favourite books of all time are some lesser known, not really talked about on the online communities, or at least to a lesser extent, so it's always worth venturing out and trying some new, lesser known books. Which leads me into the books I'm currently reading. So I'm currently reading 2 books. First of all, we have Into the Rift, which is the sequel to Flames of Mira, which is a book I've talked a fair bit about, and it's still such an underrated series. And the second book is, of course, The Dance of Shadows by Rogbot Payne. I am already a chunk into the Rift, and it's funny because a lot of people might not know this, but one of the reasons why I made this channel was to hype up Flames of Mira. If you go back to my first ever video, it's top 5 underrated fantasy books, and I made it to really hype up those 5 books because I thought not enough people read them, and one of those was Flames of Mira. So of course, I was very excited when the sequel Into the Rift came out, and I'm a chunk into this, and I'm having a really good time with it so far. So let's get some reading done. So I am over halfway through Into the Rift, about page 282 of about 505. And I went in with high hopes, but I think this is still better than book 1, Flames of Mira. It's really good. There's some really interesting world building and lore that's only really touched on in Flames of Mira, and I was always hopeful that we were going to learn more over the course of the series, and this is definitely fleshing out a lot of those ideas. And a lot of the mysteries from the first book with the world building and the magic system and kind of this tyrannical leader of the world, there's a lot of question marks with the world and the civilization that we are following who live underground. And this is really answering a lot more of that than I thought it was going to. I don't know how long the series is planned to be, but we are getting a lot of answers and really interesting twists with kind of the world building and the plot in this second book. It blows my mind that this is still an underrated series, but you definitely need to check out the Rift Walker series from Clay Harmon, because this second book, that means good. And done. So I have finished Into the Rift, the second book in the Rift War saga, and I loved it. It still blows my mind how underrated this series is. It is so much fun. And book 2 does everything I really enjoyed about book 1, but just takes it up a notch. So if you enjoyed Flames of Mira, you will definitely enjoy Into the Rift. This really has become one of my favorite series of all kind. Of all time. Which just makes me really wonder how much incredible works there are out there that just aren't getting enough eyes on them. Because Flames of Mira is definitely an underrated book that just isn't talked about enough online. And it just makes me think how many other incredible books are out there that just not enough people are talking about that could become all-time favorites. And there are kind of 3 main things that I really, really enjoy about this series, because I can't really talk that much about book 2 specifically other than it's an improvement over book 1. But overall, there seems to be 3 main points that really draws me to these books. And that is, number 1, the world building. The world building is fascinating and really unique. It's unlike anything else I have read. It follows these people who live underground because the surface of the planet is inhospitably cold. It's got flesh-binding magic and some really interesting lore and history that really gets fleshed out in that second book. Can't go too much into. That just has some really fun ideas. The second thing is the pacing. The pacing in both books is really, really well done. It's so evenly and well paced. There's no bits that kind of drag out, or there's no bits that go past too quickly. Clay Harmon does a really good job of making a very streamlined story, but making every single chapter count and hook you in. And the third thing I really like about this series is just the sense of adventure. There are very few books that I just kind of takes me back to when I was a kid reading a book and completely sucked in on this grand adventure. And I can't even tell you what it is. I can't tell you why it's there and not there in other books, even other books I really enjoyed. But this series has it. There's just a sense of adventure and a sense of fun that is really hard to capture. And I think Clay Harmon does a really, really good job. So with that finished, next up we have The Dance of Shadows by Rogba Payne, which is another one that not that many people are talking about. But I do have a couple friends who adore this book, so I'm really excited to give it a read and try it out. So let's get to reading. So I am a chunk into The Dance of Shadows. I am just over 50 pages in, so that's probably about 10%, I think. And I'm having a really good time with it so far. I really like Rogba Payne's writing style. It is very descriptive. He likes his description work. But some of them are just really beautifully written, and I do really like the setting and the main character. We do have multiple main characters, which I don't know why I'm surprised with, but I just had it in my head that this was single point of view story, but it's not. We've also had a villain point of view chapter, which was really cool. I love when fantasy books switch over to the villain for a chapter. Oh, and I forgot to say, one thing I do really like about the main character, Rumi, is that he's a musician. Why do I like that he's a musician? Because in fantasy books, or in just books in general, it is super rare to have a main character that has a hobby. It's just not as common as you would think, and I was trying to think about why I like the fact that he was a musician and why he makes his character more interesting. I think that's what it is. I think that we don't really get enough characters that have interests outside of kind of just usually sword fighting or magic wielding of some kind. It's nice to have something a wee bit more relatable as a hobby, and it just makes it more well-rounded and interesting because they have this passion outside of the main narrative. However, it does also play a part in the plot as well, so it's still tied and still relevant to the story. Okay, I am more than halfway through The Dance of Shadows, and I am just realizing how crushed this jumper is. Don't think about it. But I was just reading The Dance of Shadows, and there was a line that I thought was absolutely hilarious. It was something like, they have less going upstairs than a bungalow. And I don't know why, but the line just really got to me. I thought that was hilarious. It's really not a funny book. There's not a lot of humor in it, but there is occasionally the odd joke. And that was one that really made me laugh. I thought that was hilarious. However, I am also really enjoying the story and the narrative. I have so much to talk about with this book. There is so much to it that I want to discuss. It has such an interesting but bizarre structure to it. But it does so much that I really, really enjoy. So let's make some coffee and then I'll give you the update. So Dance of Shadows is an interesting one. It has a really slow start, and I think partly that's because the inciting incident, the incident that really kicks off the bulk of the plot in this first book, happens way later in the story than it does in a typical fantasy book. So normally you hit the inciting incident about 10 to 15% into a book. I think in this it was probably 20-something% in. And there was kind of a mini inciting incident that happened before that. That was kind of just for that first section. Once we moved to the main inciting incident, kind of the main plot kind of picked up from that point. I think for me that kind of bogged down the start a little bit. I think the start could really be trimmed down. However, I had in my head that I might not enjoy this book at that point, and now I'm maybe 60% of the way through, and I am having a really good time. So it definitely picks up hugely after that inciting incident. There are so many sort of classic fantasy feeling parts to the narrative that I'm really enjoying. There's almost this Wheel of Time-esque moving between towns as we are kind of fleeing from this enemy. I'm also really enjoying the world building and the lore. There's a lot of really interesting myth and backstory that's built into this world. And I'd be really interested to know kind of where some of the inspirations come from. I think it's African. It could be also Mayan. I'm kind of getting Mayan from that, but I don't know enough of those mythologies to tell you if it's one or the other. However, there's really interesting sort of deities and this founding of the world with these gods that created it, and all this sort of history that is just getting teased throughout the narrative. And later on in the story, we do get these short little passages of this past, and that sort of stuff I'm really, really enjoying. It's almost like reading Greek myths. So it has the gods kind of interacting with each other and some of what happened for the founding of the world. I'm filming this update and I've got someone at the door. Come on then, you come. What do you think of Dance of Shadows? Okay, so I have now finished The Dance of Shadows, and I really enjoyed it. The second half of this book is so much better than the first half. Once we get into the latter and we have met all the main characters, and we're kind of seeing a lot of the dynamics kind of build between them, and we have this long training section when we're kind of in one area. One of the parts about the start of this book is we are all over the place and we visit lots of different locations. We have different point of view chapters. However, the narrative really settles in for the second half, and it's just really good. Especially if you're into academy training sequences. There's quite a lot of that in the second half of this book, and I really enjoyed it. The world building was great, the side characters were great, the plot was excellent, it was quite unexpected at the end. I highly recommend you check out The Dance of Shadows. I was really impressed with this book. And I have heard that the sequel is even better than the first book, so I will be carrying on to A Testimony of Blood at some point soon. So some of the biggest complaints I hear about the online bookish communities is that we all recommend the same sorts of books like Brandon Sanderson. Super common, really highly recommended. So consider this some different recommendations for you to try. Very underrated, and both series are fantastic. However, if you're looking for some recommendations for some fall reads, definitely check out this video. But thank you very much for watching. Outro.